when the program was constructed, there were some comments from the last year that instead of always talking about new and novel drugs, we should also try to create some clarity on conventional antihypertensive drugs which are being used. Tomorrow we're going to talk about new and novel drugs, but this session is on established antihypertensive therapy, how we are going towards clarity. We talked about ARBs and then beta blockers, and now my responsibility is to provide some clarity on the role of diuretics in the treatment of hypertension. Ever since the guidelines started for hypertension in 1972 till now, 2026, various guidelines, national, international, American, European, British, World Health Organization, all guidelines, so many guidelines, one common denominator in all the guidelines has been the diuretics. Beta blockers come and go, CCBs came later on, but since 1972, diuretics have been in every guidelines in one form or another, so there is consistency to it. So my responsibility is how to give some clarity on the choice of diuretics in the treatment of hypertension. Now, last year, after so many years, US FDA has approved low-dose diuretic chlorthalidone for hypertension. It took a long, long time, and my late partner, Dr. Norman Kaplan, I remember, he has written so many times to FDA, long documents that low-dose chlorthalidone should be approved, but unfortunately it never happened during his lifetime. It happened later on. And when the FDA hearings were going on, one of the past presidents of the American Society of Hypertension testified before FDA last year that chlorthalidone played a role in hypertension treatment strategies for decades. Having access to low-dose chlorthalidone in the USA offers physicians additional flexibility when initiating therapy. So this was his testimony, sworn testimony before FDA. This is the table from American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association guidelines, the last guidelines, and you will notice that they have now put chlorthalidone followed by hydrochlorothiazide, followed by indapamide in the hierarchy of drugs for the treatment of hypertension. The slight change that they have made in the guidelines. Now, this thing I always mention to the students and to the fellows is the mechanism of action of diuretics in the treatment of hypertension is not diuresis, not natriuresis. The mechanism of action of diuretics is vasodilatation. Like any antihypertensive drug, they cause vasodilatation. Because if you continue to have diuresis, if you continue to have natriuresis, you die. You die from volume depletion. So you don't die when you take a diuretic because the volume control is reset, and that is what is shown on this slide. You will notice on this slide, when you give a diuretic, the blood pressure goes down, the plasma volume and cardiac output go down initially, but subsequently they become normal. Although cardiac output and plasma volume become normal, blood pressure is maintained at a lower level because of reduction in peripheral vascular resistance. So what you have to do is look at the blood pressure, look at the peripheral vascular resistance. So the antihypertensive effect of the diuretics is maintained because of reduction in peripheral vascular resistance. Initial diuresis is needed, but continuous diuresis is not needed. For example, you cannot have continuous vomiting forever and live. You cannot have continuous diarrhea forever and live. You won't live, you die. So same thing, when you take a diuretic, please remember the mechanism of action is fall in peripheral vascular resistance. And this is what sometimes patients are also afraid of taking a diuretic, and this is what you have to mention to them. This is not an outcome study. This is one of the dream studies of my late partner, Norman Kaplan. He wanted me to do a 24-hour blood pressure control study comparing hydrochlorothiazide, chlorothalidone, and to see what happens to the blood pressure. So we published it, and in this study, chlorothalidone was superior to hydrochlorothiazide. First time a 24-hour blood pressure control was noted, but this was not an outcome trial. This is just looking at the blood pressure. Now, he wrote this editorial, and I see a smile in Dr. Anil Parikh's face because he has read this editorial many, many times. Very popular editorial that was written, chlorothalidone versus hydrochlorothiazide, a tale of tortoise and a hare, and he concluded ultimately it is the tortoise that won. Dr. Dominic Sika, past president of the American Society of Hypertension, wrote an invited editorial that whether chlorothalidone has always been a best type of a diuretic. Dr. Rajiv Agarwal, his name was mentioned yesterday by a couple of speakers, very prominent nephrologists from India in US, and he told me over the phone that in his experience, chlorothalidone lowers the blood pressure more than renal denervation. This is what he told me on the phone. These are the trials which have used chlorothalidone as a base for the treatment of hypertension. Large outcome trials, in fact, every outcome trial has used only chlorothalidone as a base for the treatment of hypertension. And this is a meta-analysis looking at hydrochlorothiazide versus chlorothalidone, showing that in the meta-analysis, chlorothalidone appears to be superior to hydrochlorothiazide. And this is a study from, it's called Mr. Fit study, looking at the effects of chlorothalidone and hydrochlorothiazide on blood pressure and on left ventricular hypertrophy. You will notice there was a greater fall in blood pressure with chlorothalidone, and therefore there was a greater regression of LVH. So it is not a direct effect on LVH, but a direct effect of fall in blood pressure, very, very beautifully demonstrated by in the Mr. Fit trial at the end of 48 months. Now, this is a trial that was done a number of years in patients with resistant hypertension who were on hydrochlorothiazide, published in the Journal of Clinical Hypertension, where the investigators simply switched from hydrochlorothiazide to chlorothalidone and an improvement in blood pressure. So these are the trials that were shown it. Now, 24-hour blood pressure was discussed yesterday on 2 occasions. And this is a trial looking at 24-hour blood pressure between hydrochlorothiazide and chlorothalidone. You will notice the nighttime blood pressure was lowered a little bit more with chlorothalidone compared to hydrochlorothiazide. So there was a greater reduction in nocturnal blood pressure or elimination of nocturnal hypertension with chlorothalidone. Now I'm going to discuss 2 trials that have given clarity and they have erased confusion. Then I'm going to conclude. These are the only trial ever done comparing hydrochlorothiazide to chlorothalidone head to head. Now, in the previous trials, they compared this trial versus that trial, a meta-analysis. But only trial ever conducted is the diuretic comparison project, hydrochlorothiazide, chlorothalidone. 25 milligram of hydrochlorothiazide, 12.5 milligram of chlorothalidone, and head-to-head comparison between the only trial, and this trial will never be done again. You will notice when you look at the total events between chlorothalidone and hydrochlorothiazide, chlorothalidone half the dose, the total events were very similar. And if you look at the blood pressure, very similar. If you look at the potassium, very similar. So this trial suggests, despite what people had wrong notions before, the effects on potassium are very similar between hydrochlorothiazide and chlorothalidone in patients followed for 5 years. Very, very similar effects on blood pressure and chlorothalidone. Now, they looked at patients with pre-existing cardiovascular disease. That means any patient with hypertension generally has pre-existing cardiovascular disease, either overt or not diagnosed. When they looked at patients with previous cardiovascular disease, those patients who were on chlorothalidone, they had fewer events compared to hydrochlorothiazide. It is very, very, very clear that in this group, patients who were on chlorothalidone had lesser morbidity and mortality compared to hydrochlorothiazide at the same level of blood pressure. It is not the blood pressure. At the same level of blood pressure, this was seen. And when they looked at primary outcomes, which I have shown, and they look at heart failure, the number of heart failure gurus here in the audience, including the front row, the heart failure was significantly reduced in the chlorothalidone group compared to hydrochlorothiazide. When you reduce the incidence of heart failure, you immediately reduce the incidence of other complications like stroke, CKD, etc. Once you reduce heart failure, the rest of it also follows the path. A significant reduction in congestive heart failure in the chlorothalidone group compared to hydrochlorothiazide in this study where patients were followed approximately for 2.5 years. Now they looked at acute myocardial infarction. In acute myocardial infarction, once again, there were fewer cases of acute MI compared to hydrochlorothiazide. So heart failure reduction, primary outcomes, congestive heart failure. Almost all the trials now also look at non-cancer deaths. I don't want to comment on it because patients are not screened for cancer at the time of the study. So when you look at non-cancer deaths, you have to be careful whether they were screened at the beginning. If they're not screened, you can't conclude. But nevertheless, there were fewer non-cancer deaths in the chlorothalidone group. So the take-home messages were at the same level of blood pressure, patients had fewer complications, less heart failure, less acute MI, and all morbidity was reduced. Now, if you look at adverse events, sodium, potassium, they were very, very similar. So it is very, very important to know the electrolyte effects were very similar between the two drugs. And one comment I make, and I wrote letter to the editor, which was not accepted, by the way. The letter was not accepted, which is fine. Patients were taking hydrochlorothiazide for a longer period of time, whereas chlorothalidone was given in the middle of the study, so they were taking for a shorter duration of time. Very, very interesting. Patients on hydrochlorothiazide were on it for a long period of time. Patients who were given chlorothalidone were shorter period of time. So I wrote in the letter whether the short-term exposure to chlorothalidone was as good as a long-term exposure to hydrochlorothiazide. And this is a very legitimate question, but it was not accepted. So that's all right. So the conclusion from the paper, this is verbatim, I have taken it, that chlorothalidone may be associated with reduced adverse cardiovascular events and non-cancer deaths compared to hydrochlorothiazide. This is the conclusion from both the papers. It was very, very similar. And in few seconds, I do want to mention that low-dose chlorothalidone, which was approved in US last year, to some extent, I'm sure they have taken this paper into consideration by Dr. Parikh and co-workers, who have shown that chlorothalidone 6.25 milligram was as good as high-dose hydrochlorothiazide, published in JACC at that time, and they must have taken into consideration. And one effect in pathophysiology is the pulse wave velocity, or let us say vascular stiffness, is reduced with chlorthalidone compared to hydrochlorothiazide. But you don't have to measure it, but pulse wave velocity is reduced much more with chlorthalidone. So, moderators, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, based upon the totality of the evidence, the whole nature of the evidence that we have known, it looks like the debate over the choice of diuretics for hypertension is over finally, and all the confusion that we have had no option but give way to clarity. Thank you very much.